Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to podcast 2 of debt. This is our debt series, and in the first video we talked about personal debt and good versus bad personal debt, how going into debt by itself, that means borrowing money at some interest rate, doing that by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on what you're going to use the money for and whether what it is you're using money for is something that's likely to make you back enough money, to earn you back enough money to pay the debt plus the interest. If it does that, then the debt was good debt financially, and if it doesn't, it was bad debt. But I want to talk today about national debt. So not your debt or your neighbor's debt or your relative's debt, but the debt of the nation, in this case, the United States, which has become a bit alarming recently. At least in, aggregate numbers. Now, I should tell you a couple of things up front. First of all, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to be able to speak to this issue as in as sophisticated a way as an economist might. And you should also know that economists disagree a lot about this concept, particularly, what constitutes bad national debt, how much debt do you have to accumulate to really be in bad shape nationally. I'm not going to get into the economic controversies. Like I said, I'm not an economist and don't know enough about this field to, speak with authority on that. But there are certain things we can talk about which highlights the similarities and differences between the debt you accumulate personally and what makes it good or bad versus the debt that the nation accumulates and what makes that good or bad. And there are similarities to these things. For example, not all national debt is bad debt, just like not all personal debt is bad debt. But, just like in your personal life, you can get to a level of debt that really becomes alarming and where you're not likely to be able to really pay back that debt and where it's going to hurt you economically, and nations can get to that point too. Although there's a lot of argument about where that point is, and is it the same for different nations, and how do we know when we're reaching it? But let's talk about some of the current U.S. debt facts. So now we're just looking at the national debt. 100 years ago we had national debt. And we still have national debt. Debt is not a new thing. There are all kinds of reasons that governments deliberately go into debt, usually to pay for something that the government feels they need to pay for and is beyond what their normal revenue stream can pay for. Keep in mind that when the United States began, there was no income tax. The income tax didn't come about until the early 1900s, actually. We were financing a lot of our governmental activities early on with tariffs, basically, which are surcharges on importers of goods from overseas. That was about the only tax we had originally, and then later on we developed some other taxes like, excise taxes, resource taxes, then business taxes and income taxes, and then sales taxes. I mean, these things didn't exist early on in the nation, those different revenue streams. So, we had, in the old days, more limited ways for government to fund its spending. Our government was on what was called the gold standard for many years, which is the government accumulated gold, and some of which we mined ourselves here. Some of the gold that was extracted from the United States itself, underground, was extracted by the government. So we had a gold reserve, and for a fairly decent period of time, we basically used the gold reserve as the total amount of money the government could spend. In other words, whatever the value was of the gold that the government held, that was how much the government could spend in a given year. So our spending was based on our mineral wealth, essentially. But again, there, various forms of taxation came in, and finally in the 1970s, I think, early 70s, maybe late 60s, we went off the gold standard, which meant that we no longer restricted government to spending the amount that we had in gold reserves. And we needed to do that at that time to fund the Vietnam War, which was actually extremely expensive, both in human lives and financially. We just didn't have enough gold to fund our business at home and then prosecute that war. So I think it was Nixon that took us off the gold standard finally. And also around that time we started instituting new taxes, and so we were using taxation to fund a lot of government spending, but we had no minerals or resources to back up what we were spending. So our currency became what's called a fiat currency, which means it's worth, the dollars are worth what they're worth because people believe that they're worth that, not because there's anything tangible backing up the value, just that people accept the value. People here, people internationally. But more recently, because we've had a lot of extra government spending over the last 20 years to finance the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, to cover the Wall Street mess in the 2008 crash, more recently to cover the economic disruption of COVID epidemic. So these things have been huge expenses for the government beyond the normal expenses, and they've caused our national debt to balloon a lot over the last 20 years. So is that a horrible thing? It depends on which economist you talk to, really. But let's take a look at some numbers. So our current total national debt is about 35 trillion, that's trillion with a T, dollars. That's 1,000 billion, so $35,000 billion. Currently, the national debt is rising very rapidly at about $3.6 trillion per year. It's 10% increase per year. That's a lot. We have to pay interest on the debt. So the national debt is, it's the difference between what the government makes, with the revenues the government takes in, like taxes every year, versus how much the government has to spend on all the things the government spends on, like wars and the military and programs like welfare and Social Security and Medicare, plus all the other things government spends money on, all the government agencies, etc. So government spending now is up around, I think, something like 7 trillion a year. And revenue, how much the government takes in, is around 4 trillion a year. So I think there's a $3 trillion deficit. That is, the government spends about 3 trillion per year now, more than it makes. And, that's a lot. Now, because you might wonder, how do you finance that? How does the government finance that? Well, unlike you, when you have debt, you have to, if you want to cover your debt, you have to borrow money. But then you've got to pay back that money at some interest rate. Well, the government essentially does that too. The government borrows money, but what it does, the way it borrows money is often in the form of government bonds. It sells bonds. So the government prints up bonds, like $1,000 bond, and says that, if you buy our $1,000 bond, we'll pay you back that 1,000 plus a certain amount of annual interest, say 3% annual interest on the Treasury bond. And so the government is essentially then borrowing, when it sells that bond, it's essentially borrowing from whoever it's selling the bond to. And a lot of our bonds are bought domestically by people in the United States and businesses in the United States. But a fair percentage of our debt is also held by people in other countries who also buy our bonds. We don't restrict bonds to who we sell bonds to. People in other countries can buy our debt. And a fair amount of our debt is held by folks in other countries. But again, when they buy our debt, when they buy our bonds, they're financing our deficit. They're allowing us to spend that $7 trillion because they're financing the difference between normal government revenues and what the government is spending. But we have to, just like you do when you take out a loan, you have to pay back the loan plus interest. We have to pay back the interest and eventually the principal on these bonds. So currently the interest payments on the national debt are close to $1 trillion a year, or roughly 14 or 15% of total annual spending by the government. So, that's a lot. So if the government spends, say, 6 or 7 trillion a year, nearly $1 trillion of that is just going to service the debt. That is just going to pay the interest on all the bonds that we've sold to finance our debt. That doesn't, by the way, pay down any of the principal. So we still owe all these people what they paid for the bonds. This is just the interest on the bonds. So it's as if, for example, you charged up thousands of dollars on your credit card and all you could afford to pay back was just the interest on those thousands. But so every year you pay back just the interest, but that means that every year you still owe the principal, those thousands of dollars that you charged up originally. So if you were doing this just you'd be sort of in an endless financial hole. Now, doesn't the same thing apply to the government? Isn't the government now in an endless financial hole? And the answer is pretty much yeah. And because our debt is going up every year, the interest is going up every year and pretty rapidly. So that means every year a higher and higher percentage of federal spending is actually just going to pay the interest on the debt. That is, pay the interest on all the bonds that we sold to cover our debt. And you might think, well, is that a bad thing? And the answer is, well, that $1 trillion we're spending on the interest is $1 trillion we can't spend on other stuff. That we may think is more important than that, or, we may prefer, like we can't spend it on, increasing, healthcare, government-funded healthcare. We can't use it to build infrastructure. We can't use it to fund investment in new technologies. We can't use it for the military. And each year it's a higher percentage of the total of federal spending. So that means each year we have less to spend on other stuff that we might consider more important than this. And that can hamper economic growth, and our ability to take care of our own people. So is that a bad thing? I tend to think yes. Plus, if you look at the U.S. as far as what's called the debt to GDP ratio, that is, how much total debt do we have versus how much does the United States produce in total goods and services every year. That's what GDP means. Gross domestic product. That means if you total up the value of all the goods we produce here every year, plus all the services we produce here every year, what does that total out to? And the answer is it totals out to about 35 trillion a year. Actually, about a little less than that, probably about 30 trillion a year. So we actually have more current national debt than our GDP. It's higher than 100% if you do the ratio. And that's considered bad. That's considered economically dangerous when your debt to GDP ratio goes over 100%. That is, when the total amount of money a government owes is more than that government can produce in a year. Now, what's interesting about that, and this is part of the reason that economists argue about this, they tend to think that once you get over that 100%, that 1-to-1 debt to GDP ratio, that you're in bad shape economically. But if you think about personal debt, a lot of us buy homes at some point. And when we buy a home, we take out a mortgage. And typically, because home prices are so high now, and our incomes haven't really kept up, it's very possible, for example, for a person who makes, say, $120,000 a year to buy a home that's in the $400,000, $500,000 range. And in which case, if you take out a loan, if you make under $20,000 a year, you take out a loan for, say, $360,000 to help you buy a home, you've actually incurred a debt that's 3 times your annual income. The GDP is essentially the annual income of the whole country. It's considered bad by economists when the debt level goes over 100% of the country's annual output. But when your personal debt level goes to 300% of your annual income, it's not necessarily considered a disaster. Lots of people get into personally much higher debt when they buy homes than the government's current debt, if you look at it as a ratio. So why is it okay for individuals to have a debt that's 3 or 4 times their annual income, or it's not okay for the government to have a debt that's more than 1 time its annual production? So the answer to that question is not completely obvious, although in the case of housing, at least what you're spending your money on is generally an appreciating asset. Houses usually go up in value over time. And so you can justify going into more debt to buy something that's actually making you money, right? Whereas when the government, if you look at GDP, a lot of that money doesn't really accrue directly to the government. It's taxed at some rate, but the actual money the government receives from the GDP is really much less than the GDP. For example, we may produce goods worth $100 billion, but the government only gets a taste of that. It gets just the taxes on those goods, which may just be 10 or 20%. So whereas when you buy a home, you get the value of the home. If it appreciates, you get the full appreciation value. So, another way you can look at this is the reason that safe debt to GDP is lower than household debt, personal debt, has to do with the fact that the government really doesn't see the full value of the GDP. It only gets a taste of the GDP. So, a 1-to-1 debt to GDP, as far as the government's concerned, is really like a 10-to-1 debt to income ratio, which is bad. They wouldn't let you take out a loan for a home value that's 10 times your annual income. I don't know any responsible bank that would do that. So that's one reason they sort of peg debt to GDP at 100% as sort of the danger zone. And we're significantly above that now. I think we're at like 120 or 130%. By the way, this increase in the debt has happened during Republican administrations, during Democratic administrations. The last year, the U.S. government didn't run a debt. just in a single year, was actually in surplus was 2001. That's 23 years ago. And since then, we've had Democratic, we've had Bush Jr. Years, we've had the Obama years, we've had the Trump years, and we've had the Biden years. And the debt's gone up in all of those years. So there isn't any one party that's not guilty of this. Everybody runs up deficits now. Okay, so one problem with the deficit that we've already talked about is that the bigger your deficit, the more money you have to pay on debt service every year. That is paying the interest, the more you have to pay in interest, and that leaves you less money to pay for other things that might be more productive for your society. So that's one problem. Another problem is the potential for inflation. If the government starts selling lots and lots and lots of bonds, to finance its increasing debt, at some point people may not want to buy those bonds anymore. They may start to see the U.S. debt situation as risky for them. Maybe the U.S. at some point won't pay back its bonds, or will pay them back in deflated dollars. We'll talk about that in a minute. So at that point, if people get less enthusiastic about buying U.S. bonds, then the government has to offer more interest, higher interest rate in order to get people to buy the bonds. And then that debt service amount goes way, way up real fast. And you get into real trouble as the debt service becomes a much higher percentage of annual spending, leaving a lot less money for the government to spend on other things. Now, one thing governments can do that you can't is governments can actually print money, quote unquote. They don't really print money. This isn't actually about churning out more $100 bills with the printing press. But the government can do what's called expanding the money supply. And that's actually something the Federal Reserve can do. The Federal Reserve has the balance sheets of all the banks, and it can add money to the balance sheets of banks. It can essentially just press a few computer keys and magically make bank balances higher. Not the balances, by the way, in your particular account, but the amount of money that banks can lend. It can just make that higher. And when it does that, it's called expanding the money supply. So banks can expand, the Federal Reserve Bank can actually expand the money supply just by making sure that banks have more money to lend, not by increasing the value of existing accounts at the banks, but giving the banks more money that they can lend out. So that's a way of expanding the money supply. The risk of doing that is deflating the value of the currency. So people around the world in global financial markets see that the Fed is doing a lot of this, a lot of just expanding the money supply at banks. Then people may feel like, well, that's going to hurt the value of the dollar. Now there's more dollars out there. And supply and demand, if there's more dollars, they can be worth less. Because, and if people feel that way, if investors feel that way, that can lead to inflation, which is the dollar doesn't buy as much as it used to because people just don't feel like it's worth as much as it was because there's a lot more of them. So another way of saying that economically is when you expand the money supply, you expand demand. You give people more money, people have easier time getting loans usually, and that expands demand in the aggregate, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it depends on what people are demanding and whether there's a supply of it. If the supply doesn't keep up with that increased demand, then you get inflation. Whatever it is people want to buy the price of it goes up. We're seeing that now, for example, in the housing market. People can get home loans. It's not as easy as it was during the crazy 2008 time, but people can get home loans. And the banks are willing to lend people money to do that. The problem is that there aren't homes, not enough. And so you've got essentially expansion of the money supply in that realm, the home lending realm, but that's chasing a supply that just isn't there. And so that creates a supply and demand imbalance, increasing demand, no increase in supply, so the prices are going up. So you're getting what's called asset inflation, inflation in the value of homes, which is, I suppose, good if you own a home and pretty lousy if you're trying to buy one. So it's caused some real wreckage in the home buying market. And that knocks onto the rental market. As homes get more expensive and fewer people can afford to buy them, more people are left having to rent. And so now there's a higher demand for rentals, but again, there isn't an increasing supply of rentals. And so the rental market's going up, and so people are paying much higher rents. So you're seeing inflation in home values and rents, in part due to an expanded supply of money available for loans in those areas for home buying. But unfortunately, that's chasing a market where there's no increase in supply. So there's increase in demand, no increase in supply, and you're getting the result of that, which is inflation. So the bottom line is adding to the money supply, which the Fed can do, and which the United States can do because we control our own currency. We're not using somebody else's currency, right? It's not like Italy and Europe who has to use the euro. They don't have their own currency. We have our own currency. We have the dollar. And in general, the United States is seen as a safe economy. That is, we still have a growing economy. And, we're doing pretty well when it comes to employment and inflation, except for a few years during the pandemic. So we're pretty much seen as a safe economic environment, and that's why people are willing to keep financing our debt and buying our bonds, because they realize they're going to be paid back, and they're going to earn some interest. So people are continuing to finance our debt, and so far they're not worried about our dollar inflation. That hasn't the easing of credit in certain areas has not led to. It has led to inflation in certain sectors like housing, but it hasn't caused people like overseas to be afraid that the dollar is going to be devalued and demand higher interest rates on their bonds, for example. Okay, so this is a complex issue, but the bottom line is right now the United States, even though we have very high debt, increasing debt, high debt to GDP ratio, we're still seen as relatively safe economically by the rest of the world. So people are still willing to finance our debt at relatively low interest rates, which means that the increase in the money in the lending amounts that we've been doing hasn't yet caused a spike in inflation overall, or hasn't caused us to have to pay a lot higher interest rates on our bonds. So that means we've been able to sustain our debt, to manage it in the sense that we've been able to borrow at relatively low interest rates throughout this economic period. But at some point, this becomes a serious problem. Again, you can argue about where that point is. Are we close to it? Are we still far from it? I'm not enough of an expert to give informed opinion on that. But I can give informed opinion on this, which is that the more in debt you get, the more it matters what you spend the money on. And you have to really, if you want to ever get yourself out from under, you have to start spending some of that borrowed money you've got on something that really helps the economy, that improves us economically, that improves our safety and well-being, because that's government's job. I mean, the government's job is to keep the national economy going and to improve the well-being of its citizens, safety and well-being of its citizens. That's its job. So the money you're taking in, you've got to be able to spend on things that will do that. So are we doing that? Are we spending a lot of our money on things that improve our well-being? Well, you can argue the debt service is just allowing us to maintain what we've got, not really helping us expand, especially when more and more of our money goes into paying interest on the bonds that our government sells. You know, again, it depends on how you define safety and well-being and economic improvement. Our economy's been, with some glitches here and there, like due to COVID disruptions and due to the 2008 financial crisis, our economy's been pretty decent for an extended period of time in the sense of relatively low inflation, high employment, people have jobs, but that's looking at the macro. If you look at the micro, it's not been so decent. Inflation, there really has been a lot of inflation over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the United States, and wages have not kept up with that inflation. So on a personal level, most people feel poorer than they remember being, say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And in fact, they are poor for the most part. Not everybody, but lots of people are. Their wages just in that period of time have not kept up with overall inflation, which has actually been pretty steady. Things are a lot more expensive now than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, but our wages aren't that much higher. We talked about this a lot in our inflation versus wages series. This sort of overlaps with that. So there's a lot of discontent in the land right now in the United States because most people feel economically poorer than they did 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, because essentially they are, for the most part, economically poor. So have we used our debt to improve the economy? Not really. We have used it to maintain, we have been able to maintain relatively low unemployment, which is good. I mean, most people who want jobs have them. But the employment is increasingly not paying basic expenses. So people feel in a very precarious position economically. Have we improved the safety and well-being of our citizens? Maybe to some extent. A lot of people cite military spending, is that keeping us safe? Well, I suppose, no one's attacked us since the United States homeland since World War II, other than, of course, terrorist groups, but no national actor has done that. We do have a very mighty military, and most nations are afraid of what we could do with our military. So, they don't seem content to attack us. So from a safety standpoint, I guess we're safer in that sense. But on the other hand, there are both foreign and domestic terrorists that attack us on a regular basis, and mass shootings are more common. And the crime rate has gone up and down. Right now, actually, the overall crime rate in the United States is on a downward trend from a high a few years ago. But, do people really feel safer? I don't think so. Because, we have a lot of these highly publicized terroristic events, both domestic and foreign, mass shootings and stuff. People kind of don't feel safe anywhere now. Your school can be shot up, your mall can be shot up, your sporting event can be shot up, who knows. Anytime you go out, your concert, Um, I think people looking over their shoulder. Are we better from a health standpoint, or is our well-being better? Well, no. Um, we certainly have a lot more drugs than we used to, and treatments for things. And in some cases, the treatments are more effective, and we are seeing some health improvements. But overall, I wouldn't say our population is healthy. We have a pretty high infant mortality rate, especially among non-whites, compared to other nations. We have reduced lowering life expectancy. A lot of that's due to COVID, but some of it's due to also things like increasing cancer rates among younger people, higher accident rates, higher suicide rates. So, I mean, are we physically and mentally, emotionally better than we were 20, 30 years ago? I don't know. I definitely wouldn't say yes for sure. I think you can make case either way, but so to the extent that government can help us help its citizens financially, help us with our safety, help us with our well-being. Have we made some progress? Yeah. Are we improving relative to other developed nations? No, we're actually kind of slipping behind in a lot of ways. Do people feel better about their state now economically or safety-wise or whatever than they did 20, 30 years ago? I would say pretty much no. So, again, the debt we're taking on, good national debt improves things economically, safety-wise, physically, health-wise, whatever. And the debt we're taking on now doesn't seem to be dramatically improving anything. It might be allowing us to sort of tread water and stay where we are, but it doesn't really seem to be improving much. So, again, bad national debt can either cause serious inflation, which our debt has not done so far, but it also does not improve the economic or safety or physical, emotional well-being of its citizens. And yeah, it doesn't look like our debt is doing that. So I have to say that a lot of our current debt is being spent on things that are not helping as much as you would like the government to help. And this is why a lot of people are pissed at the government and why they want to see really big change in the government, because government spending hasn't done right by them. Even as the government's gone into more and more debt, that debt hasn't been helpful. So, what can we do about that? Well, my feeling is that this is just me, but I think our government really needs to look at some big, giant, home run type swings as far as using the money that we can spend and maybe even going into more debt to try to get something that really works for the citizenry, that really improves our situation economically or from a safety or from a physical and emotional well-being perspective. And that will probably mean, because a lot of the money we're spending now, we're spending on things that are pretty much already promises the government's already made, money that's already spoken for, and that people would be really upset if we took away, like, things like Social Security and Medicare. So one thing, and would be very controversial, I think we should do is, I think for a short time, we might consider really expanding our debt and probably government revenue too. But expanding our debt fairly dramatically for a number of years in order to tackle two big things that are real economic burdens. And the reason we might want to do this, to make this problem much worse in order to make it better later, is, the treading water thing is just not getting us anywhere except gradually worse. And so the only two resolutions to that is either to dramatically cut government spending, which would decimate all kinds of industries and people's incomes and livelihood. We could go that way in order to bring the spending back into balance with the revenue. But if we did that, we'd run a chance of a real downward government spiral, where the sudden cut in government spending leads to dramatic decreases in spending nationally, business, personal, which leads to dramatically cut government revenues, which leads to more cuts in spending, which puts you on a death spiral. So you could go that way, but you're probably looking at some very, very bad situations down the road. By putting the government back in balance, you can actually dramatically unbalance this entire system and maybe lead to a point where the government becomes truly insolvent. So that's one option. Another option is to just keep doing what we're doing, which is putting us in a gradually worse situation year by year and not really dramatically improving things for most of our citizenry. Or we can take a big swing the other way, which is to increase revenue, increase debt, big time, temporarily, to fund some major initiatives, which really have the chance of 5 or 10 years down the road, dramatically improving things economically or the well-being of our citizenry. So two things that have been mentioned a lot is one's called Medicare for All. And I did some podcasts on that, which is essentially making the government the health insurer for the country and taking that burden away from private citizens and from businesses. So that's one thing we could use a significant increase in debt to fund, at least the beginning of. And another, and this one I think is really important, finding alternative energy, developing serious alternative energy sources that don't contribute to global warming, don't produce greenhouse gases, and can make us truly energy independent of other nations. So big time investment in clean energy expenditures to develop an entire clean energy infrastructure, which we currently really don't have, and to do essentially government funded health insurance. Those are the two big ones that I would aim for, because I think they have the potential of having the greatest positive impact in the lowest time frame. Now, are they both risky? Yes. Because you're looking at a temporary, pretty dramatic expansion of the national debt, which, as we said, can have knock-on consequences that can be bad, particularly in the form of inflation and much higher cost to service the debt. But I think that's really our only shot at this point. Anything else, any other half measures we propose or status quo things we propose are not going to get our citizenry, most of our citizenry, into any better shape anytime in the foreseeable future. And going the austere route, which a lot of Republicans favor, of just bringing our expenditures in line with our actual revenues, is probably going to be economically disastrous in the way it's going to decimate industries and incomes for people, leading to just a downward deflationary spiral to the point where the U.S. can become insolvent. So, you've got three risky options here. My personal feeling is you go for the option that has the highest upside, which is really taking a serious swing at tackling a major impediment to the U.S. growth financially. And you hope for the best. But that's my take on good versus bad national debt. I hope you found this interesting and informative. But it's okay if you didn't. And it's okay, as usual, to violently disagree with my conclusions here. But I still hope to see you at the next podcast.